I want to just flesh out this China-DPRK relationship as it stands over the last 10, 15 years. Because, you know, China was approached in 2003 by then Colin Powell, I think, under the Bush administration, to facilitate talks. It did so, and those talks broke down, but it's still the formula in which they want to get back to. What's China's strategic purpose in going for these six-party talks and three-party talks that we saw in the early 2000s?
Well, China's, I think, primary objective is to promote substantive dialogue between North Korea and Washington. At first, in the early 2000s, North Koreans made it very clear that they only wanted to talk with the Americans. But Americans didn't want to talk directly with the North Koreans. That's why China started with organizing the three-party talks with North Korea, U.S., and China. And then, given that Russia, South Korea, and Japan also had major stakes in the region, so they were also invited. But the primary objective is promote direct engagement between Pyongyang and Washington. But I think given that there was some reluctance from Washington during the negotiations, especially after they reached the September 19th joint statement, for some domestic reasons, the United States quickly imposed a sanction on North Korea, frozen North Korea's assets in the Banco Delta Asia, and that dealt a major blow to the six-party talks. And later on, when they made further progress, the U.S. decided to impose and required very strict on-site inspections on North Korean facilities. So those measures ultimately led to the breakdown of the six-party talks. But I think from the Chinese perspective, the format is always useful. You need to have all the most important regional stakeholders at the table in order to talk through their differences.
Brian Becker, there was this period of the 90s where there was energy guarantees, there was a winding down of the nuclear fuel capability of the DPRK. There was even the thought of a US president going to visit Pyongyang and these security guarantees. And then, you know, the three-party talks, six-party talks to try and avoid a crisis, but then that unraveled very quickly. Why couldn't China and its approach to the DPRK bridge this suspicion from the US? Did the US just not have anything enough vested into the talks?
Yeah, I think it wasn't a top priority for the United States. The United States at that time was bogged down in Iraq. That was a big issue, a consuming issue for the Bush administration. They thought it would be easy, but it turned into a major battle, a long-term battle. There's something else too, which one of your other guests referred to. Neither the United States or the DPRK was really that excited about the six-party talks. And you have to look at it in different ways. DPRK was worried that the United States would use Russia and China, its historic allies, as part of a leveraged group against the DPRK. In other words, instead of the DPRK just challenging and being challenged by the United States, that there could be a block against it. What the DPRK always wanted was direct bilateral relations with the United States. They felt that's where they could get a real read. The other thing is you never know when you're negotiating with the United States whether it will turn its back on the agreement. Look what's happening with Iran. The Obama administration signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with the P5+1. Now the Trump administration, a year or two later, has had more sanctions. So the DPRK feels alone and insecure, and it realizes that China has its own interests, and the interests of China are really stability. The interests of stability first and foremost for China's peaceful rise. The DPRK feels their existential existence is at stake, and as a consequence, they feel the nuclear capability is the only thing that gives them a guarantee, providing protection from attack, and also leverage in any future bilateral negotiations. Freeze for freeze, in other words. That's really where the DPRK is going.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up freeze to freeze now as well. So you in China, you've covered this many times. Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China has talked about this double suspension, which is known here in the West as freeze for freeze, freezing ballistic missile and nuclear testing in the north in return for some reduction of war games in the south and by the US and the Republic of Korea. This is another Chinese push, which has got a lot of international backing, but not from the United States. We heard Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, the other day saying it was an insult. Why are we not seeing these Chinese facilitation moves, considering the tensions, bearing fruit?
I think it depends on what the strategic intent of the United States is. From the Chinese perspective, China has done everything it can to ensure that all the stakeholders can sit at the table and talk. But the problem is Americans would not talk to North Koreans because it seems that they are equal as talking partners. This is not something Americans want. But for China, this is what we can do. And to solve this problem, it takes North Koreans and Americans to be serious about this. If Americans do not want to give in anything, I don't think they will succeed at trying to bring North Korea get nuclear free in any way.
Yeah, Pepe, Escobar, you're in the region. How worried are people that the U.S. intentions may lead to some sort of war at the moment? Because the rhetoric has been very strong, and the mechanisms whereby the U.S. and the DPRK can talk to each other have basically disappeared. Is there a worry that absence of these efforts, that we could see a misunderstanding leading to war?
Well, there is already a misunderstanding, and there's already a rift between Washington and capitals in Asia, and especially in Europe, with Brussels as well. Angela Merkel, she said a few days ago, the only possible solution is 5+1 talks. The Russia-China strategic partnership, the same thing. I want to bring attention to what happened in Vladivostok last week at the East Asian Forum. The two Koreas were there, they talked to Putin face to face, and they agreed on a trilateral consultation mechanism for what? More connectivity, trade, and diplomatic talks. The North Korean representative said, okay, we agree with all that, but not starting now, meaning the order of priorities. First, the 5+1 talks, and then we're going to talk connectivity, including the Trans-Korean Railway, which the South Koreans want to. They've been discussing this since at least 2002. And this would be a way to connect Korea, because don't forget, South Korea is isolated from the Eurasian mainland because of North Korea. If you build a Trans-Korean Railway and you integrate North Korea into development of the Korean Peninsula and link it with the Trans-Siberian and with Eurasia, we're talking about Eurasia integration, which is, from a Chinese point of view, this is what it's all about. We need stability in Korean Peninsula. It's okay if we mix the Eurasian Economic Union, the new Silk Roads, the Trans-Korean Railway, all leading to the same point, which is Eurasia integration, stable, and with no threat of war.
Brian Becker, this sort of step-by-step approach has been mooted quite a lot, especially in terms of building trust and decreasing tensions. China's very much been part of that push. Is there any scenario you can see, we're having the UN General Assembly, Trump's going to be there, of any of this getting any traction?
There could be. Donald Trump has the capacity, he has the authority. If he had the will and the desire to make something happen, he could make something happen.
Because he hasn't ruled out meeting with Kim Jong-un.
He hasn't ruled it out. You have Nikki Haley, who I think is just running for president in 2020, yelling, oh, the North Koreans are begging for war, making provocative statements. Trump himself has made provocative statements about fire and fury. But if Donald Trump could wants to do something, he could. Let's not forget, Richard Nixon was the most hostile force against Red China. And then he turned around and through secret diplomacy led to a historic shift in U.S.-Chinese relations. It's all possible. It's all there. It's all they're capable of doing it. Do they have the will? And is the issue of American hubris, or I would say hubris, not pride, such that the United States can't treat the DPRK as equals? If they could, something could happen.
Interesting point. Tong Zhao, I also want to bring up sanctions. We've seen actually rare unity in the United Nations Security Council of late as China, US, Russia, and others have signed on to ever-increasing sanctions against the DPRK. China has gone along with these sanctions, but it also has resisted a complete oil embargo, for example, that the US were pushing last time. What is it in the China-DPRK relationship that China where China gets this policy from? Explain it, because a lot of people feel that China doesn't want to go along with punishing the DPRK, but it does have consequences, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed. China is taking on increasingly costly economic consequences for sanctioning North Korea, but that's a very small part of the equation. Increasingly, as China starts to strangle North Korea's economic stability, North Korea is starting to threaten China. There were reports that North Korean officials said that their Hwasong 12 missiles can cover every corner of China, which is a very thinly veiled threat to China if China is seen by Pyongyang as the one that leads international efforts to push the regime into a corner. So China is taking on very high security price in the process of trying to mediate the crisis. And also for China, there is a major question that cannot be answered, which is even if we can adopt a comprehensive embargo against North Korea and forcing the regime to face the possibility of collapsing, what will happen next? Of course, one possibility is North Korea will back down, but the more likely possibility is North Korea will choose to be even more provocative, believing that it can win this game of risk-taking competition. The North Koreans has higher stakes in this game, so it can win this game of risk-taking. In that scenario, North Korea becomes more military provocative, increasing its military threats to targets in South Korea, Japan, and Guam. How do we deal with that?
Right.
I think there are huge uncertainties. We haven't thought through those questions, and the United States especially, I think, needs to do its homework and really figure out, is that really the result we all want?
So yeah, a final word from you.
I want to add something about the sanctions. In China's eyes, sanctions won't work. Even the toughest sanctions will only hurt the North Korean people, not the ruling class. They always have access to get things they needed to get the machine working. Sanctions won't persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. On the other hand, if we go with full-blown sanctions, that will leave China with no options at all. Further down the road, China needs to keep its options open. China cannot cut off the lifeline to North Korea. It won't help North Korea, it won't help China, it won't solve this problem.
So yeah, in Beijing, also Tong Zhao in Beijing, thank you so much. Pepe Escobar in Bangkok, and Brian Becker here in the Washington, D.C. studio. Fascinating discussion and a really illuminating one on the long and troubled relationship between China and the DPRK. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.